Welcome everybody, my name's Jonathan Breckon. I'm the director of the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which is a network that champions the cause of using the best available research and evidence to help frontline social workers, police, teachers, policymakers, and others. And we're obsessed about this issue of, can you have research that isn't just for the glory of research in itself, but actually is useful and used? And what we're going to talk about in the next 75 minutes is particularly the area around children's social care, children and families. Now, certainly in the UK, this is a really difficult, complex, challenging area, beset with all sorts of issues such as rising demand for services, a 15% turnover of social workers, desperately in need of research, evidence, behavioural insights that we can get to the front line. And what we're going to do is have 3 talks in this area. And we're also going to have a very practical experiment, which Michael's going to explain in a moment. So you get your hands dirty. But before we go into that, I'm just going to introduce those speakers first. And on your far right, we have Isabelle Trowler, who's the Chief Social Worker for England. She has to deal with all that politics as well as dealing with the front line, and has also been inspirational in setting up a What Works Centre for Children's Social Care, which we're going to hear about later on, which is really gathering all the best available global evidence that can be useful and used for social workers, families and children. And then next to her we've got Ashley Whillans, who is the Harvard Business School. You're a guru in all sorts of things, particularly on well-being, and she's going to talk about some of our results. We were talking about why she's in a business school. Don't worry, I think she covers everything, not just as business. And then finally we have Dr. Michael Sanders, who is the Executive Director of the What Works for Children's Social Care, but is probably a familiar face for at least 500 people of the 1,000 here from his role as Chief Scientist for the Behavioural Insights team. But we're getting him to zero in on children, families and children's social care. But before we start, I just want to get a sense in the room how many hands up is directly involved, whether in policy or research or in other forms, with children and families and social care. Okay, oh wow. Okay, so at least 3/4 of you are directly involved. Good, we've got the right audience.
Here or abroad?
Okay, so how many are just in the UK? So about half of that group. And how many outside of the UK, just to cover? Okay, nice balance, so another half.
Good. Yeah.
So we got a good international mix, good mix of people that are directly involved with that. Good. All right, Michael, before we go, do you want to talk about our little experiment in registering?
Sure. So experiment is possibly a strong term. So you will notice that unlike other sessions in which other people are presenting today, there'll be very little in the way of bar charts because we are very new and we don't have very many results. There will in fact be exactly 1 bar chart. This makes me feel quite unwell because having been chief scientist at the Behavioural Insights team for 7 years, I've basically been in charge of a large bar chart factory. So we are working our way towards having more of those. In the absence of evidence, we are going to ask you all to, over the course of the session, vote on which of our interventions you think are going to work the best, and whether or not in some of these trials you think they're going to have a positive effect on the things we care about, a negative effect on the things we care about, or no effect at all. It should be said for those of you who are playing this game for the first time that about 75% of all things don't work. So if you're saying that everything's going to have a positive effect, I admire your either optimism or faith in our abilities. But the likelihood of that panning out is reasonably slim, although, you know, a man can dream. So we'll be asking you to vote on that. If you find these things interesting and you would like to know what the answers to the questions we're posing over the course of this session are, then we are also asking you to take part in our first poll, which I believe can go live imminently, in which we're basically asking you what your name is. If you tell us what your name is, then when we have the results of these trials, we will email you and say, excellent news, nothing works, or excellent news, everything works, or terrible news, everything makes everything worse. Or more likely, some normally distributed mix of those three outcomes. So yeah, please tell us your names, and then we will email you out the results as we have them. I should also say that you can follow the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care on Twitter. Please don't send too much abuse.
Thank you for that, Michael. So yeah, do register. You can see the details there. Isabelle, we're going to hand over to you.
Yeah, great.
If that's all right. And 20 minutes. Do you mind if I'm quite ruthless with that, so we can get plenty of time to do the?
Okay, great.
Thank you, Isabelle.
All right. Okay, I'm going to stand over here so I don't drop my papers. You can hear me well? Yeah? Great. Okay, so as you know, I'm the Chief Social Worker for England. I'm based in the Department for Education, but do quite a lot of cross-departmental work. I've been in the civil service for 6 years. Everybody said that I'd hate it, it'd be dreadful and awful, and I wouldn't achieve anything. And actually, it's been a fantastic 6 years, and we've got a lot of really interesting stuff off the ground. Prior to that, I was in children's social care for about 25 years, mostly in child protection in local government. So that's my kind of background, and I have, pretty much lived and breathed the work that we do with children and families in England for the whole of my career. So I think my job is to give you my perspective on children's social care in England, and tell you a little bit about how it operates here, and to tell you just a little about some of my worries, I suppose, about the brave new territory that we're embarking on with Michael and co and the What Works Centre, and then I'll hand over for the rest of the conversation. So we spend about £10 billion on children's social care a year in England, that we help with a really wide range of social problems, as you'd imagine, and then we're really in the business of protecting children. That in any one day in England, we're working with about 400,000 children, and we've just discovered that over a 6-year period, we actually have worked with 1.1 million different children. Children's social care is often perceived by everybody that's outside of children's social care as slightly messy, that it's a bit mysterious, it's always misunderstood. But actually, I think it's quite a contained service. That we're organised across 152 local authorities in England, and as a consequence, we are organised in 152 different ways. So everybody has a local discretion about how they organise their services. That it's mainly built around teams of social workers. It's very hierarchical, in my opinion. So we have social workers, but we have layers and layers of management above the practitioners. That we're quite process-driven, and that we have a huge range of practice rules that are built into statutory guidance and legislation. I might add, most of them dreamt up by people that are not in practice. That we know a lot about these, the 400,000 children that we're working with on any one day. So we know, obviously, the basics. We know where they live, who their family are, but we probably know, what they had for breakfast that morning, what their room's like, how they're getting on with their siblings, a real kind of level of detail that's really important to our work. We often say in England this phrase that safeguarding is everybody's business. And that's true for some of the time. But for children's social care, safeguarding is our only business and all of the time. So child protection is our highest context. And when we're not trying to ensure child safety, then we're very focused on child stability. And by that, I mean looking primarily at improving how families are functioning, how we reduce family stress and conflict. And we do that through a range of means, but things like building family relationships, accessing resources for families, and providing really quite intensive practical support sometimes within the family home, both to help with parenting skills, but also sometimes just the practical running of a house. We work within families, and you as an audience won't be surprised, where addiction and serious violence is commonplace, where sexual abuse within families is a frequent feature of our work, where enduring parental mental ill health or learning disability within a context of really entrenched poverty and family conflict means that children may very well not be able to live with their families. We go to court to ask for removal of children at least 22,000 times a year. We recruit foster carers, we run children's homes. We look after approximately 70,000 children at any one point who are on our care system. We support care leavers, and we recruit adoptive families and offer post-adoption support. Adolescent self-harm, suicide, exposure to criminal exploitation are increasingly part of our practice in England. And non-accidental injury is commonplace. So we're talking multiple fractures, bruises, burns on children and babies, and some of whom are less than a few weeks old. So not so long ago, I did a presentation to the Behavioural Insights team on the nature of practice and the sorts of things that we do. And David Halpern and Michael at the end of it said, God, you could have gone a bit easier with them, you know? But I just think it's really important that when we're having this conversation today, we just recognise how harsh the lives of children and families are that we're talking about. It's really serious business. But amongst the really heavy stuff, we do a lot of really nice stuff too. And some really simple, kind things. And a week ago, I was in my garden in the sun, shortlisting for the Social Worker Awards. And I found myself in tears because of the stories that I was reading. And I just wanted to share some of those with you. Because one of the real tensions in our work is how we flip constantly between this really harsh, perceived as punitive action towards families, and then we shoot to these multitude of really kind and caring tasks. So what a social worker does, these are all examples, she trawls flea markets for days to find an old copper kettle in which a care leaver can lay to rest the ashes of her foster carer. She gets up at 3 a.m. to take a young person to an award ceremony in London on the bus. She fights for funding so that a family can learn British Sign Language together so the father can build much closer relationships with his children. She attends a ceremony at the fire brigade with the mum of the young person who said, I just would not have been able to go without that support. A mum says, the social worker is like an angel for me. You came into my family and I wish you came before. I missed the opportunity for my older son, and I will regret this always. She does silly dances with different glasses and crowns on, just so a young girl gets a chance to laugh. She helps a young person clean her grand's house, who is now too ill to do it anymore. A mum who has a second chance at being a parent because her other children have been previously removed says, I hope she knows she changed my life, and I'm going to be good at it as well. She uses puppets and worry monsters and a wealth of tricks that she keeps in the magic cupboard to help her work with children. So I think it's really important to also understand that a lot of our day-to-day activity, though, is not about creating change and improving outcomes. We're constantly making decisions about who gets what. So we're constantly balancing risk with resource and acceptable levels of state intrusion into private family life. So every day we're making thousands of these sorts of decisions. And we're the people that are actually constantly saying no. We say no to families and we say no to professionals. And we're a real buffer between the families and professionals that are not getting what they want and the people who hold the purse strings at both local and national level. And we wonder why we became the bad guys. It's a deeply political activity. It's very closely related to the public concern of the day. So social work is intrinsically connected to society and how social workers or social work behaves and the sorts of things that it does always reflects the moral mood of society in any particular era. So we spend a lot of time fighting for resource and fighting for the rights of children and families, and many would describe it as a rights-based profession. But there are rights to have things, but really critically, and I think sometimes too often forgot, that people also have the right to be left alone. That we live in a liberal state, that we believe in liberty and privacy and fairness, and that we believe in limited state interference. And we pride ourselves in England on personal freedom and that we are able to choose the way that we live and that we bring up our children. So I always see social work as a key check and balance against the worst excesses of state intervention and state control. We are often the part of the public service that people just wish would go away, with a kind of, rather not touch, with a sort of too difficult box. The whole of my career, as long as you're not in the headlines, and this is local and nationally, people are pretty much happy to leave you alone and get on with it. But because it occasionally rears its head, we have historically been really subject to the ebb and flow of political attention. But for the last 6 years, we've had something different. And we've had a really sort of steady, incremental focus on children's social care. It's not been welcomed by everybody, I would hasten to add. But I think that as a consequence, we have started to get a grip on things. And I hope an enduring grip. That we're starting to build an evidence base that's starting to answer 3 critical questions. So who should we be working with? What should we be doing with them? And how should we be organised best to do it most effectively? We've recently had a £200 million investment in England where we tested a range of different interventions and whole system change programmes. We failed a lot, but we learnt a lot too. We did quite a lot of evaluation. We could have done it a lot better, but we did it well enough to convince the Treasury and Co that we should have further investment to roll out our most promising programmes, and that's what we are in the process of doing now. We do have an improving system in England, but it's very, very fragile. And alongside that, we've been trying to build a national infrastructure for children's social care, something that we've not had before, a set of institutions which we're building to weather the ebb and flow of political storms. I won't say anything more about that. And one of the institutions is the What Works Centre to help us answer those 3 questions. Now, I have fought tooth and nail for the establishment of this centre. I'm a founder member of the board. I'm hopefully going to be a trustee as it moves into charitable status. But the rub is, I know that they're going to ask me to do things and approve of things that actually make me feel really uncomfortable. And there's no better example of this for me than the March of Predictive Analytics. Now, the Behavioural Insights team have done some early work on decision-making in social care. There's a number of local authorities that are really interested in this, in the children's social care space. Oh my goodness, I've only got 5 minutes. I'm going to have to tell my sat-nav story. Yeah, okay, good. So every second Tuesday, I review all child deaths and serious injuries in the preceding 2 weeks of children. It's usually about 30 to 40 children. And often we're always asking ourselves, is that could we have predicted this? So could we have found, in effect, the needle in the haystack? Could we predict the 100,000 that are on child protection plans before any of the bad stuff happens? Some say we can get better at discerning who should be in and who should be out of the child protection system. Michael says we might be able to. I'm really trying not to be a dinosaur on this point, but it's difficult. I've had a 30-year bias against the very idea that anything could be better than me making those decisions. I've made thousands of those decisions, and I have a huge range of vested interests in believing that they were the right decisions to have made for those children. But Michael, at this point, will say, Isabelle, don't worry. Do not worry about the machine. They will never take over. They are just there to assist you in your thinking. And let me tell you why I worry. So I started driving in London when I was 20 years old. I've always had a car. I drive absolutely everywhere, all the time. I know the place like the back of my hand. I could give any black cab driver a run for their money on their knowledge. And if the A to Z is not imprinted on my brain, I've always got a hard copy in the glove compartment, okay? And that's how I've driven for years. And I've done very well. And I whiz around driving. I read the map, going around roundabouts. I sometimes go the wrong way on a one-way street, that sort of thing. But I always get there. I've always done that. Obviously, sat-navs came along. And all my friends and all my family, horrified that I was still trying to do this drive, look at the A to Z, and said, why don't you just get a sat-nav? I said, I do not need a sat-nav. Thank you very much. I can do this perfectly well on my own. And I held out for the longest time possible. I eventually got a sat-nav because I was going to holiday in France. And I battled hard against this sat-nav for 2 years. Started to use it when I came back from holiday. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than beating the sat-nav and getting somewhere 2 minutes earlier than he told me that I was going to get there. Occasionally the sat-nav won, but at first I just tended to ignore its success. I wasn't really interested because I still thought I was right, even in the face of all the evidence. But over time, the sat-nav was winning. And there was a seminal moment when I was gridlocked on the A102, and news reports of people taking 3 to 4 hours to travel the 2 miles I had ahead of me. I racked my brains about how I could get out of this situation, couldn't work it out, so I asked Waze, and he got me home in 30 minutes. And we drove through car parks and estates and tiny little back streets that I never knew existed, and the personal war against the sat-nav was lost. It was a cruel defeat. But something else has happened too, and this is very serious. So I've become really lazy in my thinking. I've suffered a low erosion of confidence. My road instinct is weakened. Truth be told, I've become dependent on the sat-nav. I'm no longer disciplined in the way I think through my journey. I'm much less strategic about the journey that I want to take. If I'm late, I take no responsibility whatsoever. So I worry, and I worry about the tools that could be created to assist in our decisions. But it's indicative of a general feeling of unease amongst the sector, the presence of the nudge amongst our settled status. The introduction of RCTs and children's social care has sent some people absolutely apoplectic. How can we possibly be even considering it? I don't even understand half the debates about RCTs, but I do understand that you can't stop progress. I'm completely seduced by the intellectual leap that I think behavioural insights brings wherever it goes. I'm completely convinced that Michael and co will help us answer the who, what and how questions. I think it's a disruptive simplicity. It's kicking into touch received wisdom, and I welcome that, unless it's my own wisdom, of course. So I think the What Works Centre will shake up the orthodoxy, be gently disruptive, and offer challenge and insight. And I warmly welcome that. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you for that. That was a fantastic overview of the importance of this and the desperate importance for the role of social workers as well. We really need to support them as much as possible. And wouldn't it be great that the evidence and behavioural insights as part of that? We see so many other professions that part of that development and their status has been about almost the humility that you need to be open to research, and sometimes your professional judgment and following that digital map is not always the right thing. What a fantastic overview. Michael, can you answer the who, what and why in 20 minutes?
No. I'll give a stab to talk about the kind of things that we're working on at the centre. So Isabelle has painted me sort of, first she says social workers, they end up being the bad guys all the time, but also RCTs, people don't like those. People, and like Michael loves machine learning, which is really controversial. So I appreciate attempting to unload bad guy status off of social workers and onto me, and I'm happy to carry that for a little while. Hopefully I'll be able to disabuse some of you of the notions that Isabelle has planted in your heads that I'm a comedy villain. I'm just a comedic. So I will start with my own sat-nav story, which is why I don't really trust machine learning either. So I've been working basically in London for the last 7 years since I came into Cabinet Office to work at the behavioural insights team when I was about this height, but I looked taller because I had more hair. And I went up to UCL. So UCL is about a half an hour walk from here. I don't own a car, I can't drive. Generational difference, possibly. Also, I'm just very lazy and can't be bothered to learn to drive. My wife can drive. And I'm reminded constantly that I should learn at some point, and I'm sure that I will in the fullness of time. So I walk everywhere because I hate the tube and I can't drive. So I walk up to UCL and I obviously use my phone. I get my phone out, it tells me how to get to UCL. I get to UCL, I have a very productive meeting, we agree. The Behavioural Insights team's PhD program. You're going to bring me a microphone, thank you ever so much. I don't like these walking microphones. It seems like I'm at a low rent comedy gig.
Never, not low rent.
Thank you. You can come again. So I have a really good meeting. I step outside. Because I am quite incompetent, I haven't charged my phone that day, so my phone has died over the course of the meeting. I am half an hour walk away from my office where I go every day. I've worked in London for quite some time. I have literally no idea how to get back to my office. So what do? Do I stumble around London for half an hour? Yes, I do that. Do I sort of try and find the tube station? I managed to walk around for half an hour in London and not find a single tube station, which is actually quite a feat of skill when you think about how many of those things there are. So what I end up doing is going into an Apple shop, buying a phone charger, going into Starbucks, using their plugs, charging my phone, and then I turn up back at the office 2 hours late for my next meeting because I had to do all of these things and then get back to the office. So there is a risk of us becoming somewhat over-dependent on technology. So Isabelle has lost her road sense as a consequence of GPS. I've never had any sense of any kind because I've always had GPS. So yeah, so I'm not as pro machine learning as perhaps I come across. So I'm going to talk about sort of what we're doing at the centre at a fairly high level, and then Ashley's going to talk about some specific examples because Ashley's the cool one of the two of us. So Cass's talk last year at BX, he talked about sort of that's a number. There's sort of this, like, we can talk about numbers and they allow us to frame a debate, but they don't actually tell us what's going on. So it's very important, I think, while I'm talking about lots of numbers, for us to think about the reason we're doing this isn't for, as Jonathan said, for the sake of doing research. I love bar charts, but the reason we're doing these, the reason we're producing these bar charts is to enable social workers to perhaps be able to do their job with a bit more confidence, be able to support them in doing that job, have a few more tools in their toolkit while they're doing that job, and ultimately to achieve better outcomes for children and families. So I will talk a lot about numbers, but let's not focus on the numbers. Let's focus on the actual reason we're doing this. So we have about 75,000 children in care at any given moment in this country, and that's sort of rising gradually over time. Over the course of the last 10 years, about 1.6 million children in this country have needed a social worker for one reason or another. You know, for those of you who aren't from this country, an average birth cohort in this country is about 750,000. So that's, of our cohort between 0 and 18 years old, that's really quite a substantial portion of this. Most people who don't work in children's services just really have no idea of the number of young people who are interacting with this system. And you know, one of the great things about having the post of chief social worker existing is the fact that you actually have people in government who understand that it's actually quite a large number of children. So that's a number, but it is a big one and one which is worth us remembering. Over the course of the last, in the last year, nearly 2,500 young people had care proceedings brought against them within 1 week of them being born. So that's very, very rapid, and that number has increased by 50% over the course of the last 10 years or so. This is a pretty large rise, and there are lots of different things causing that, but this does mean there is a lot more work going on in the system, a lot more social work to be done. Young people who are in contact with this system one way or the other have worse outcomes in education, in health, in criminal justice, in homelessness, and in almost every other metric that we care to mention on average. There are lots of bright spots, there are lots of children who do very well, and they do a lot better potentially than they would do with the system not to exist. But there is a lot of work to be done around trying to help young people to thrive and succeed in life, and that is what we're all here, I guess, to do. So there is not currently a strong quantitative causal evidence base in child social work. This does not mean that there is no evidence base at all. There is a lot of high quality qualitative research. I am not talking that research down. It is very important. We need that. There is a lot of good descriptive quantitative data which tells us what is going on in that system. All of the numbers I've told you so far, somebody else has had to do research to come up with those. That's really very important. What we don't have, as I say, is strong causal evidence. So if we do X, then on average, what will happen to Y? Things like that. We don't have very much of that. So how effective is a given intervention? How effective is a given practice? How effective is a given anything in the system? Those are largely questions which are followed by more question marks than they are with numbers. So efficacy isn't the only thing that matters, right? So is an intervention ethical? Is it okay for us to do this? Does it meet with our societal norms, with our code of conduct, with our morality? Is it humane to do this intervention? Does it protect the rights of the child? Does it protect the rights of the family? As Isabelle says, we have a default of sort of privacy and liberty in this country, which means that even if we were said we could improve everyone's educational outcomes by taking every single child into care because all parents are rubbish at it, and as somebody with an 18-month-old, certainly 50% of the people who live in my house and are adults are bad at parenting. So, it's a number. It's verifiable. Anyway, so efficacy isn't the only thing that matters, but it's a thing that matters, and we can't ignore it. We can't pretend that we can just look at ethics, we can just look at humanity, we can just look at rights, and that's everything. That's the entire story. We need the entire picture. Okay? And so and I don't think this is what Isabelle's doing, while it's possible to try and paint this as numbers are everything, all we care about is quant, and all we care about is causality, I'm not saying we should only care about those things, but I am saying we should care about those things. Okay? So if you disagree with me, then there'll be a Q&A session, and I'll be at lunch, so you can argue with me then. Or indeed at any other time. I'm also on Twitter for arguing with, although I don't tend to reply. So what are we doing? We're trying to build up the evidence base. So that means of the things which we're currently doing, of the new ideas that are coming through, which of them are working? How are they working? Who are they working for? And how well are they working? So those are the kind of questions we're trying to answer. We're also trying to build a pipeline of evidence. And that means that when someone comes up with a new idea, an innovation. So we had a social work innovation fund, and the government loves an innovation fund. It's a really good alternative to thinking. I'm not a civil servant anymore, so I'm allowed to say things like that. But anyway, an innovation fund. So innovation really is, in the context of most jobs, I've been doing my job for a long time. I'm pretty good at it. I've thought of a different way of doing it to somebody else, and I'm going to do that. So social workers are doing that all the time. Almost all social work is innovation in some sense of the word. The problem is it's quite difficult to get funding to scale something up or take it to scale unless you're either quite senior or you're in the job of producing evidence to begin with, i.e. unless you're an academic. So what we want to do is help the profession to start building its own evidence base from this idea when a frontline, normal social worker says, I have a different way of doing this. How do I build an evidence base around it to see if it's working, to see if it's having an effect, and to see if it can be spread more widely? Because great practice, if it exists in a pocket, should exist in much larger pockets. So that's our idea. Building the profession's understanding of evidence, and this is partially because it's very easy for people to say, we are doing evidence-based policymaking, right? I just said it just there. I don't have to back that up with anything. I have a PhD, I'm a doctor. Actually, it's a professor, she's very impressive. We understand evidence, and that qualification allows us to try and sell people things that aren't necessarily true, because we can just say something is evidence-based. And people will say an anecdote is evidence-based. Sort of is. So, but empowering the profession to scrutinize that, to ask the right questions, to be able to sort good research from poor research, causal research from descriptive research, that kind of thing is very important to being able to actually allow the profession to use evidence. And then building the appetite, getting it so that social workers and leaders in that sector and policymakers are demanding evidence. They want it, because that's how we can move forward with things. That's what we're trying to do. We're also trying to do it very quickly. So this is the judges of MasterChef Australia, which is my favorite television program. And what typically happens on this is they'll say, okay, you've got 30 minutes and you've got to make a croquembouche, or you've got 15 seconds and you've got to roast an entire chicken. So everything has to be done. It's very complicated. It has to be done very quickly. And so that's the attitude we're going for. Those of you who are British, I'm very, very sorry, but MasterChef England is rubbish compared to MasterChef Australia. Those of you who are American, I'm really sorry, but Gordon Ramsay, no. Anyway, so that's what we're trying to do. That's how fast we're trying to do it. So far, we've been here for 18 months. We have 18 trials which are either launched or about to launch, and 37 other research projects, and we're working with 60% of English local authorities. My ability to run trials in Scotland and Wales is currently non-existent. I would love to. They're lovely countries. Also Northern Ireland, I should mention particularly right now. What are we doing? So one thing we're doing is the Education Endowment Foundation, which is the best of the current What Works centres. If anybody disagrees with me and thinks there's a better one, they can take it up with Kevin. Kevin's in the building somewhere, so you can definitely take it up with him. They've conducted a whole ton of trials to look at what works in education. And they care about what works for everyone and what works for young people on free school meals. But lots of the people who are in those schools who've been subject to those interventions are young people who have child protection plans or who are in care. And so we can go back into these trials and reanalyze them and really very quickly build up a sense of what works for these young people in education. And this really matters because we can come up with a whole range of good reasons why what works for everyone or what works for children on free school meals may not be the best intervention for these young people. We can't apply a one-size-fits-all approach to this. And so going back in and looking at that will hopefully allow us to learn about how we can help those young people better. Okay? So that's the first thing we're doing. The second thing we're doing is machine learning. So previously at BX, a guy who looked almost exactly like me, but with a slightly different bow tie and slightly more hair, presented last year a series of projects that the behavioural insights team had done on using machine learning in children's social care. And what we find is that that approach, that using machine learning, can allow us to predict with reasonably good accuracy, I would say very good accuracy a year ago, I'll say very good accuracy now, which cases which have been NFA'd, so they've been sent for no further action by a social worker, are most likely to return within 6 months as an escalated case. So they result in a more severe state intervention in family life. And so that's potentially really good, because that could be a sign that we could intervene early with those families to prevent those escalations from happening. This is really good. However, what we're doing there is we're predicting within time periods. So our holdout sample is people in the same time period, and we haven't been able to do this work at the behavioural insights team at scale. So at scale, I mean 10, 20 local authorities across the entire range of the system. This is not a failing of the behavioural insights team, it's just a reality. And so what we're trying to do now is to take this work to scale. We've been working with the behavioural insights team to do this, take it to scale, work it across different local authorities, trying to predict the actual future rather than just contemporaneous behaviour, and to think out what other kinds of questions we might be able to answer using machine learning. Now, I am a deadly cynic of this, despite what Isabelle says. So I'm a strong believer that traditional econometric analysis will 9 times out of 10 beat machine learning. But that's an empirical question, right? We can answer that question. The reason for doing research isn't to prove what I already believe. If you're going into a piece of research with a foregone conclusion of what the outcome's going to be, then probably get out of the game of doing research, right? You should probably be a little bit skeptical about your own ideas. So we have a poll, which a gentleman at the back is going to put up, so you can all vote on what you think is going to perform better. Normal machine learning using text analysis, which is slightly richer data, using traditional analysis. So if you were in Ben Goldacre's session earlier, he dissed regression analysis as a thing economists like, but I'm an economist, and so I like it. So does that beat machine learning? It has the advantage of being easier to understand, but is less technically fanciful. And social worker judgments. Is it that actually Isabelle's right, and that my whiz-bang statistics are no match for her? Very plausible. And there's a large number of people in the room who are in social work, so I suspect I'm going to lose this one. So that is that poll. We're going to go back to my slides now. 8 of you who voted. You can carry on. We'll come back to the results later on. Okay, what else are we doing? We're doing a study. Sorry? My hypothesis, yeah, I have done. But yeah, but so the previous session was about the replication crisis. Priming is not a thing that...
Confounded this experiment, Michael, that you're being called out on now.
It's not an experiment. There's no manipulation.
Okay. Well, she's... well, now everyone's been manipulated.
It's audience interaction.
Yes.
Yeah. Could be anything. I'm not priming this one. This one could be rubbish. Who knows? So sports around are interventions that have been used extensively in healthcare to help people who work in health to deal with the emotional challenges and the stress of that job. So it's an hour-long forum. People get to share their stories and their experiences and their reflections of their challenges at work. This is not focused around casework. It's just sort of to help people to share their experiences, to learn from one another, as well as sort of to offload. We're trialing that in 6 local authorities currently. Ashley's going to be talking a lot more about workforce well-being in a little bit. So our next poll, you'll be able to vote on whether you think this will have a positive effect on social worker well-being and their sickness and absence, whether you think it will have no effect on those things, or whether you think it will make things worse. So please vote now, or continue to vote over the course of the next little while. Can they continue voting on the polls after we move on? Okay, so I'm going to pause here for 10 seconds. Has anybody got any snarky questions about priming? Or unsnarky questions, those are also welcome.
Well, we're desperate to hear from the boss.
Who's the boss?
Sorry, joking.
Everybody other than me is the boss.
About the actual intervention.
Okay, so Ashley will get to that. So the final thing, this is our bar chart. Our only bar chart of the session is forthcoming, so everybody brace yourselves for a bar chart. It's also in vermilion, which is a much nicer color to work with than blue. So social workers have to make a lot of decisions every day, right? So, and probably hundreds or thousands of decisions over the course of a year of a social work time practicing. So whether or not a case that has come in from the police, from schools, from members of the public, whether that should become a referral, whether or not an assessment should happen, whether or not a child needs a child in need plan, whether they need a child protection plan, whether they should be taken into care, or whether the local authority should seek care proceedings and go to a judge. What kind of care would be most beneficial for the family, how they are most likely to end up perhaps getting reunified with their family, when reunification should happen, and how we can help children and their families to thrive and succeed in life. There are lots of different things they need to predict and forecast and make decisions about over the course of their life. Therefore, this is why we think machine learning could be helpful, is because a lot of what social workers are doing is forecasting. So social workers are making lots of predictions. The question is, can we help them to make those forecasts better? So elsewhere at BX, you will hear people saying that we all make forecasting errors. So we fail to predict the future accurately. If any of you think you're very, very good at predicting the future accurately, I would encourage you to think about, let's say 3.5 years ago, how you thought British politics over the next 3.5 years was going to play out, and see if you're any good at predicting. So we make forecasting errors, and small interventions have been shown to improve our ability to make better forecasts, to be able to make more accurate forecasts about the future. Okay. Things like calibrating people's confidences and their confidence, debiasing their thought process, that kind of thing. And so the question is, can this work in social care? Just because it works for air traffic controllers, just because it works for investment bankers, just because it works for police officers, doesn't mean it's going to work for social workers. Social workers are not the same as those other groups. So it's worth us testing to see whether it works in this environment. So what we're going to do is we give social workers, in an online experiment, we recruit social workers and we give them a little bit of information about a case. So it's just a paragraph here, 4 lines of text, telling them basically the kind of information you would get when a case came in as a contact, at that initial point. Okay? And then some background information about the family. We then ask them a series of questions about this case. So what is likely to be the outcome? So is it likely that an assessment will take place? Is it likely that a child in need plan or a child protection plan or a looked after plan will happen, whether the case is going to escalate, and sort of a couple of longer term questions about their outcomes. So in 6 months' time, will their attendance at school have gone up? And we know the true answer to these questions because these are all based on real cases that we've taken using the information that came in the point of contact in one local authority, and then what happened 6 to 12 months later to these children. So we ask them those questions. We do that twice. We get them to answer two of these, and then we give them one of 4 different interventions. A control condition, who just get asked to sort of sit around for a minute and wait for the next part of the test to start. An intervention on growth mindset, so saying, did you know you can get better at making forecasts? Think about how you can do that kind of thing. One that calibrates their confidence by saying, did you know that so far you've gotten all of these wrong? Or did you know that so far you've got 50% of them right? Or something like that, to help them to calibrate how right they were to begin with, to help them get more accurate. And then cognitive debiasing, where we show them a video, we show them some text that talks about confirmation bias and what you can do to try and avoid suffering from confirmation bias. So I'm now going to ask you which of these interventions you think are going to work. And you can vote on that. Or, of course, you can all not. One of you. So as soon as we've seen the results of this, we're going to see our actual bar chart in glorious vermilion to see which intervention works. So there's actually something on the line. Okay, so people think that confidence calibration is going to work best, cognitive debiasing somewhat less. Nobody thinks. So given the fact that I told you that 75% of the time things don't work, and this is my only bar chart, so I can't selection bias my way out of this one. I can't pick the only thing that's worked. I've only got one thing. If this doesn't work, this is all I've got. I would have thought more of you would have said control. But anyway, so confidence calibration. Thank you. Thank you to the one person who did that. Okay, so confidence calibration is our clear winner. Okay, so if we go back to my slides, what I can tell you is that a large proportion of you are wrong. Cognitive debiasing is our winner. So talking to people about confirmation bias and how we shouldn't look for confirmation of our priors when we're reading this stuff, that seems to be what's working the best in this case. So that's the findings from this research so far. So what happens next? So the first thing we're going to be doing is seeking to replicate it. So does this finding actually hold if we do it again, or have we just gotten lucky? The sample size is pretty good, but not amazing. It's about 2% of all the social workers in England. That's not too bad. Scaling up. So this is an online toy environment. If these techniques work, they're only really useful if they work in actual practice. So for social workers who are actually facing this kind of decision. Can we make these tools and deploy them into real-world situations and see if we can have an impact? What else can we do to improve social worker decision-making? Are there any other interventions? Right? So I've shown you 3 ideas that we've come up with, that David Wilkins from Cardiff came up with. There are, if I get, let's say, roughly 80 smart people in a room, I would expect to have at least 160 different ideas. What other things are there that we could test? How else could we do it? What other innovations, ideas are there? And then the next thing, which will lead nicely on to Ashley's talk, is does any of this matter? If we improve the quality of social worker decision-making, but 15.4% of social workers are leaving the profession every year, then in 5 years' time, everybody whose decision-making ability I've improved isn't there anymore, so I've kind of got to start again. And this is a problem for pretty much every aspect of practice. So I did a piece of work for the DFE a few years ago which looked at what were the predictors of higher quality or lower quality social worker decision-making based on some measures. And it turns out, and this is good news for those of you who are on the less young side and bad news for those of you who are on the more young side, is more experienced social workers are better at making decisions than less experienced social workers. So, youth is no guarantee of innovation. So, if we're losing all of our social workers before they get the chance to get experience, it doesn't really matter what else we're doing in the system. We can have a really evidence-based profession, we'll only have it for 5 years, and then we've got to start again. So, how can we improve social workers' well-being, their morale? How can we help them to try and stay in the profession for longer? This is a question for somebody much smarter than me. Handily, I have one of those right there. Ashley.
Over to you, Ashley.
All right, perfect. Thanks. Thank you so much. So my name is Ashley. I'm an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School, and most of my research focuses on broadly how we can think about motivating employees using what we know from social psychology. I'm a social psychologist by training. It's really appealing to people's general motivations for doing anything. People want to feel autonomous, competent, and related. They want to be able to form and establish positive social networks, to form communities at work, and feel like they have time also to be establishing and maintaining relationships outside of work. Many of the themes that cut across what makes organizations thrive and individual employees thrive and stay at an organization and want to build the expertise that Michael was mentioning is so critical within organizations to build knowledge, to help people make good decisions, that these motives are really important across all sectors. And so how can we help maintain, retain a happy and healthier workforce? And really that's my role on this team, is to really work and learn from all of the expertise that Isabelle, Michael, and the What Works Center has in the social worker space, and link that expertise that social workers through focus groups that we've been talking to have about what motivates them in their jobs, and link that with some of the academic research, this more theoretical approach which we're trained in as academics, and kind of bridge the gap between the knowledge and expertise that Isabelle and the What Works Center and the social workers and the individual organizations that we're working with bring, and then marry that with some of what we know and from the academic literature to figure out exactly what works, when, and for whom. So I don't get to present any fancy bar charts today, but I do get to talk about some of the ideas that we've come up with in our initial scoping process. And really, again, there is a lot of smart people in the room here, so we're really open and interested in hearing your feedback on these initial trials, and also ideas from the room, since so many people work in this space and in this sector, to hear what your thoughts are on our interventions and other ideas we might try. We have focused here on interventions, again, that really are meant to bring social workers together to help them deal with some of the demands and challenges in their job of having to make multiple decisions, to make difficult decisions. Social work, like so many public sector professions, is a high demand, high stress, high burnout occupation. So how can we help individual employees empower themselves to begin to deal with some of the stressors and strains in their jobs? So a lot of our interventions are focused on resilience, on forming positive connections, allowing for spontaneous conversations. And a lot of the research that I've been doing suggests that some of the reason why people go to work and stay at their jobs is for these social factors. So in one study that I ran, having a flexible work environment with positive social relationships where people felt like they had enough time to do their jobs was worth the equivalent of a $76,000 pay bump. That's a lot. So these social factors matter a lot for both retention and satisfaction in one's job, and that's where most of our interventions focus. Here I am. So this is the part of the stream of the What Works Center research that I'm involved with, happier, healthier professionals. And again, so we've been collaborating and running a set of field experiments. So all of the studies that I'm going to present today are in the field. We have more than 25 local authorities, partners all across England, as Michael already mentioned. And again, we're really focused on these randomized control trials, looking at how to improve subjective well-being. Overall, how happy do people feel in their lives, and how much positive mood and negative mood do they experience on an everyday basis, because there's a large body of literature suggesting how people feel about their lives and how they feel on a daily basis is linked to positive organizational outcomes, productivity, retention, and turnover, which we're also going to be measuring through administrative data, looking at actual churn. And again, this is an issue that is not only pervasive here in the social worker space, but really permeates a lot of public sector jobs and is something that organizations worry about a lot in general. So as we've already talked about, social work is high risk and emotionally challenging. This means day in, day out, as so many of you in the room here know, social workers are faced with stressors and strains and don't always have the time or the skills or the space to feel like they're able to cope in a positive way with these stressors and strains. This some of these factors produce high rates of turnover, and this actually contributes to this problem of stress on the job. As people turn over, cases have to be absorbed by someone, and often this means this constant turnover is burdening people who are already stressed and at their capacity, creating this multiplicative effect where the turnover and retention is coming back and creating these negative cycles. And that's really what we're focused on breaking here. How can we keep people in the system, in the workforce, in the occupation, so that everyone in the job is feeling more positive and better equipped and better able to deal with the stress and strain of everyday life. So I'm going to focus, so this is our general roadmap. We are launching large-scale field experiments, meaning some people, some offices are getting whatever we try, some people, some offices are not. And then we're looking at these downstream outcomes, well-being, attendance, decreases in sickness, absence, and decreases in turnover. So again, these are our organizational partners, but this is really what we want to get into. So I'm going to present the 3 interventions that we're going to be talking about, or that are in the field right now. So the first intervention that we focused on is a goal-setting intervention. Now, all of us probably feel pressed for time often, and as it turns out, when we feel busy, both at work and outside of it, what do? We actually take on more tasks and sometimes get ourselves more scattered. We work on more urgent things to get things off our to-do list, to give ourselves that sense of competence, that sense I can get things off my to-do list. And of course, this is counterproductive to feeling in control of one's schedules, taking on more work. So it can be really helpful to reduce this sense of time pressure, to reduce burnout, to really leave time every week to come up with concrete plans and goals. So our first intervention is a goal-setting intervention. And the idea is that taking time to plan and reflect on progress toward personal or work-related goals can decrease time pressure and increase subjective well-being. Even in the absence, so I have data suggesting even in the absence of actually following through on this plan, simply taking time to plan makes us feel more in control of our schedule and can produce these downstream positive consequences for well-being. So the intervention, social worker teams are randomly assigned and allocated with 30 minutes of protected time each week to plan and reflect over an 8-week intervention period. And we ask people to come up with plans that are very specific and actually go through this planning implementation process. And there's been research, and this program that we're doing has been validated in the literature already. We're not going to go through that slide. That was a busy slide. All right. So this is kind of an overview of what the program looks like. People log in, and every week they are able to go through modules. And again, they have 30 minutes blocked off in their calendar to do this every week. This is team-based, so everyone on a team is engaging in this intervention together. So they have week 1 is making goals, week 2 is visualizing goals, planning to achieve them, overcoming obstacles, putting it all together, and a final review. So they're going through this goal-setting exercise and program. And this is an example here. So we again, give some prompts about what these goal-setting plan should look like to help people really set goals that they're likely to follow through on. And so good action plans should be specific and realistic, and getting people to try to identify at least some action steps that can be carried out in the next week. So they're asked to do this every single week. So this is the kind of first intervention. Teams are getting this program that they're asked to do every week over the course of the intervention, and we're measuring the extent to which this helps with subjective well-being, stress, and turnover. Is there a slide now where people get to vote on things?
Yes, if we ask, so we can.
So we want, again, your thoughts on whether this planning, goal-setting intervention is going to have a positive effect, a neutral effect, no effect. If just participating in this program for 30 minutes a week is going to have a positive effect on the outcomes that we care about. One person is not sure. All right, great. That's helpful feedback. I should note now, so I didn't want to tell you in advance, it's actually can be, we now need, I think, an intervention for this intervention to get people to actually do the program. So I was saying that social workers are very busy and very stressed. They care about well-being, but they have a lot of other things they're doing too. Caring for children and families being their utmost priority. And so what we're finding so far in our preliminary data is the uptake rates of this are quite low. So now it seems that we might need an intervention for this intervention, which is shown to be effective previously, to get people to actually complete it in the first place. So maybe that's something you can help us think about ideas for at the end of the session. So we can move on now to the second intervention. Thank you. So the second intervention that we're trying is the symbolic awards intervention. So there's been a lot of research in the behavioral science literature suggesting things like certificates, tokens, meaningful awards that people can hang up in their offices as a symbol of their work and recognition can have disproportionate effects on things that we care about, workplace well-being and belonging. It sends a signal that, hey, we recognize the work you're doing, and people get to display it. It's there in the environment as a reminder of the fact that someone noticed what the positive work that they brought. And so this intervention is we are giving coffee and tea to different offices. This one got a little bit of interest on Twitter, I think. But this is...
Coffeegate, by the way.
Yeah. Perfect. Maybe this is one of the tweets that Michael saw and didn't respond to. And so we're wondering if the provision of free access to coffee and tea result in some of the things we care about, both as a symbolic award. So we'll see here in a second that the coffee and tea is going to have a letter from a senior official as a note of why they're receiving it, attached to it in addition to the provision of coffee and tea as a symbolic gesture, a reward, a recognition of the hard work that's done. So now, we're going to vote on this. So who here thinks that this is going to have a positive effect, a negative effect, or no effect? The effect on the public perception of this has been one thing, but we'll see if it is actually effective.
Very interesting.
All right, thanks. And shall we look at the third intervention that we're trying? All right, we can move on here. So this is another form of a symbolic award, but this time it's going to be a letter. This is a letter of appreciation that's going to be mailed out to individual social workers as recognizing employees for their daily efforts. And this is based on a lot of research. Some people might be familiar with some of Adam Grant's work in this area, so highlighting the positive impact that individual employees are having on their recipients can produce significant increases in productivity and well-being in the previously shown literature. So right now we have social workers who are individually being randomized to receive letters of gratitude from a senior, well-respected figure in their authority. And we're looking again at our key outcomes here as a result of this intervention. So you can see that these letters are personalized with the social worker's first name, 2 lines of specific feedback that we're soliciting from employees' managers. It's going to be sent to their home address, and it's going to be signed off by a senior level official. This is an example of the letter here. And so let's take a vote on this one. So if we think this is going to have a positive effect, a negative effect, or no effect. I wish it was this easy to generate actual results, Michael.
And that's how the replication crisis happened.
Yeah, you're right.
Very positive.
All right, perfect, great, thanks. So we can move slides. So this is just an example of some of the surveys that we're doing. And so we're going to analyze the results and publish our reports detailing our findings early next year. And of course, we're going to publish results regardless of whether we find positive, negative, or no effects. And maybe we'll now also put your predictions data in these reports to see what a group of informed, an audience that was informed, whether to look at your predictive ability on our field experiments. We're going to also extend this research to other public sector fields, teachers and police officers, and we're going to run another round of interventions, hopefully several rounds of interventions. This was really just a start, taking things that we had seen in the empirical literature that we knew were grounded in theory and testing these interventions that we thought were scalable and feasible for our initial round. And so we're interested in hearing your thoughts as well on subsequent experiments that we could run. I think that there's a slide on that too, right? So I think there's one more survey where people can tell us their thoughts about other interventions that we can run, unless they're, Michael, we don't have that one? They can email us? Okay. If you have other ideas of things that we should try, that would be great, and you can send us an email. We really do take your thoughts into consideration, and all of these interventions have been adapted and refined in collaboration with key stakeholders. So we're really interested in hearing your thoughts, both on these interventions and also on other interventions that might work to improve the outcomes that we care about. So we already did that, and we're already here. Michael, is there anything else I need to say to wrap up the session? Okay. So thank you for all of your thoughts. We're really interested in engaging with you after this session to really understand your thoughts on what works, what could work, what we're doing, and how to make it better. And thank you again for all of your participation in the session today.
Thank you, Ashley. We've got 10 minutes of questions. In fact, you might have some suggestions right now about how we even carve in time to social workers' diaries just to do 30 minutes of goal setting. But you might have other questions for the 3 speakers in this last 10 minutes. Is anyone, we could maybe do them in groups since we have got a little time. Do you want to have a quick, can you just say, make it really quick as well, because they're really pushed for time in terms of the question.
I'll just talk loudly. My name is Catherine Scott. I'm the Director of Policy at the British Psychological Society. And we've been doing some work with our members, lots of which are clinical psychologists, counselling psychologists, so similarities in terms of what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis in terms of dealing with others' trauma, going into situations where some of the conditions are not what you would expect from a normal job. It's not an office job. And what we've experienced is lots of kind of stigma around those clinicians themselves actually coming and being able to disclose that they're struggling with their mental health, and that they're sort of, that there's this kind of double bind with them being, I'm suffering from mental health conditions myself, but my job is to support people with mental health conditions, and therefore the barrier for me is higher. So I wonder whether that's something that plays into this field around social work, which I think is just so important, and the overlaps there, and whether there's we've been doing some interventions around that we could talk to you about, but just whether that's something that comes into play here.
Ashley, do you want to have a go as a social psychologist yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I know Elizabeth Linos, who was speaking in another session concurrently with this one, has some research with police officers to get people to open up and talk about their feelings and process some of the experiences and the trauma that they're having by framing it as a learning or a teaching opportunity, rather, a mentorship opportunity. So being able to deal with some of the emotional the negative emotional experiences that people have on a daily basis by talking about how they kind of deal with it in their own lives to others as a training tool can make it seem less stigmatizing. It's less about me. I mean, it's still about my experience, but it's less about, they're about how I struggle and more about how I do struggle, but using it in a positive direction. So that could be one way. And this is actually something we've been talking and thinking a lot about, as well as how do you make these interventions acceptable and less stigmatized? Yeah.
Can I say something about that? I think it's a really interesting question, and because I think that there's a real difference depending on how old you are. So for people of my age and my kind of generation, we just have no time for all that. That's kind of our sort of instinct. It's like, for God's sake, just get up and do the job. We don't want to hear about how difficult and hard it is. Yes, it's difficult and hard, but just go and do the job. And there's a really different culture within workforces now. And I myself have had to really shift on that. Whereas you can't go around and just get on and do it. It's just not going to work. And I just think that as people of my age are moving out of the leadership roles, and you get a new generation of people who have been brought up in a different culture, we will see something very different, I think, which I recognise as a positive thing. So, yeah, it's I think it's a generational thing as well.
Is there anyone in the audience as well who has some tips about how we can carve out time in their diaries to even do an intervention? Do you have a suggestion on that, or another question?
Yeah, I do have a suggestion that's maybe a little draconian. I used to work, I was in ad agencies, and the bane of our lives were timesheets and getting people to complete timesheets, and the only time that it ever happened was when folk had email access blocked on a Monday morning until such times as they completed their timesheets. So if you could get people to sign up for that, knowing that it is for their own, personal good, but it may be a little paternalistic, I don't know.
Good idea. So you force it through timesheets. It's in your diary. You have to do it. Yeah.
Social workers have a fit. You can try it. Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Was there another question out here?
I think.
Oh, coming up. Let's have a look at those. While I look at those, there's somebody in the back who was going to say, yeah, do you want to say?
Just another idea around getting social workers to participate in the programme. I work for the NSPCC, and we've been using, looking at how we can use behavioural science to support practitioners, social work practitioners, to be able to use an assessment tool, a neglect assessment tool called Registered Care Profile 2. I've emailed Isabelle before about it. And one of the things we've been looking at that is about getting social workers to really understand the benefits of using the tool. And I think it would be the same again about the benefits of completing the work plan, being very clear about what the benefits are to them personally, using nudges that we've heard so much about to kind of to get them to do that. And once they've done it, to then recognise those benefits for moving forward.
Isabelle, do you have any suggestions about how we have this kind of resistance that we've seen with psychologists where, you go along and say, how about the Happy Fi app? And this is something that really helps you, it's evidence-based. I use it every day. It's an amazing resource, but people are even asking the question of how do you internalise that motivation that this is for your good as a social worker?
I think my response will just tells you everything. It's like this sort of the culture that we've created is such a fraught one, and actually, I think it's so much to do with the leadership of organisations and how you have to the senior leadership have to create the conditions in which if you give someone what was it called, that app? Happy Fi. They're just, they're going to actually be able to receive it. And so I think there's one of the things that we've said about the What Works Centre is that it is about practice and interventions with families, but it's so much about the practice system that people are operating in and how you create cultures which are conducive to the type of work that we do.
We're running out of time, and I've got a few questions up here. Is one of these yours, by the way? No, I've got an additional one. Let's have a little bit of bias towards the digital for a moment. First, how do you involve children? We talked a lot about social workers, we talked about researchers, we talked about the institution, like a What Works Centre. How do we involve the children in the design of the solution and the trials themselves? Right, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways. So when we're deciding which interventions we're going to be testing, not so much for the social worker wellbeing ones, but ones which are more child focused, then we do go through a process of involving young people in sort of discussions about what is the sort of canonical version of this, how do they feel about the interventions themselves, having been through them, because lots of the time we're testing things that already exist to some level somewhere. We also have 3 young advisors who are 18 and 19 years old, so they're no longer currently children, but they have been recently, who are care experienced young people who we meet with on a regular basis, myself and our chair, Sir Alan Wood, and we talk to them about, here's the research we're planning, here are the ideas we've got, what do you think about this, what do you think about, at a high level, this kind of trial design, do you think that if we did it this way that everyone would talk about it and it would be ruined, and that kind of thing. So we do try and involve them in that sort of decision-making process about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And how we're going to do it is, I think, equally important as what we're going to do. So if you go to a local authority and you speak to the Director of Children's Services, then about half the time they will tell you they've got a multi-agency safeguarding hub or MASH. And if you go and you look at the way that MASH operates, there will be 76 different ways. Those 76 different local authorities are doing that thing. So what does it actually mean to be doing a MASH? And if we were to say, let's do a randomized control trial to see whether or not MASHs work, which version of that? And I think very often what my experience has been is that the people who've actually been on the receiving end of services, so that's children and their families, have perhaps a better sense, certainly than me, or an equally valid sense of what is the best possible version of this intervention. And if we say that one of the major lessons from behavioural science is that little tweaks to a system, little changes in the way you do something can make a disproportionately large difference, that flows both ways. So when we're at BX and we're all being smugly triumphant about the power of behavioural science, we mean we're going to save the world using these small tweaks. The flip side of that is if you get the small tweaks slightly in the wrong direction, then you can make something that was going to work not work. So that really involving young people, their parents, their families, carers, extended families, and social workers in deciding what is the best way of doing a family group conference before we test it, rather than finding out in 2 years' time that it didn't work because we didn't do the right version. That kind of involvement, I think, is the way of doing it. But we do have to, just before I tie up, we have to be, I think, fairly careful about placing too much burden on young people in terms of, please make a randomization decision for us, what's the best way of running this trial. So, yeah, I'm a little bit paternalistic in that sense.
Thank you, Mike. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I know there were some other questions, but we are going to feed back to you, yeah? We've got anyone who's registered their names, we're going to tell you the results of those trials. And before we thank the speakers, I want to feed back something from a government minister where it was about 2013. He was called Oliver Letwin. He was a cabinet officer minister, and he helped launch the What Works centres around the corner at Nesta. And he said something which I think is really appropriate for the What Works for Children's Social Care, which I feel hearing today, which is like we look back in 10, 20 years' time and go, this was obvious. What was the alternative? We really need institutions to gather the best of behavioural insights, the best in research. Not for academia, it's very much not in universities, although we've been working with all sorts of universities in the UK and overseas, such as Harvard Business. How can we get this into the hands of social workers to help everyone around it, the families, the children, the policymakers? I really do think it's a no-brainer and it's here to stay, whatever form. But can we thank our 3 speakers, and I'll end up